podcasting from a remote location somewhere deep in the heart of New York City. This is Crypto Characters, and I'm your host, Jason Nagy. Our guest for today is the formidable, inimicable Ryan Singer, CEO and President. Is it President, Ryan, or is it just CEO?
CEO, President, Co-founder.
There you go. CEO, President, and Co-founder of the Chia Network. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, let's see, I'm 34 years old. I'm about 5'9". I enjoy long walks on the beach.
That's exactly what we're looking for. Right. So you're kind of famous. I mean, I was watching a show, The Rise and Rise of Bitcoin, or movie, I should say, the other day, and you were featured fairly prominently. There were a couple of characters that were in there, but you were in there a whole bunch, and that was the time that you were you had I think just or recently become the COO of TradeHill, which was the largest at that time, the largest Bitcoin trading platform in the U.S. Right?
So there were actually two companies called TradeHill. There was the first Bitcoin exchange in America that was started by Jared Kenna, and that shut down when they had a dispute with the payment processor Dwolla, and a lot of money got held up in that dispute for a while. And a lot of consumers had to wait a while to get their money back. Then after that whole thing settled down, I met Jared at the Future of Money and Tech conference, which is put on by my friend Brian Zisk. And we hit it off, and we started talking about how Bitcoin could be not just a really good thing for consumers, but also a really good thing for business. And we started the second company called TradeHill together as co-founders that became the first institutional Bitcoin exchange. So our customers weren't retail customers. Our customers were people like Coinbase, BitPay, Fortress Investment Group, and the Winklevoss twins.
There you go. So you've been in it from the beginning, or from pretty close to the beginning, right? So what I'd love to hear about is what drew you on your road to the crypto world. How'd you get started in this particular part of your life?
Yeah, I was, at the time I was a researcher at Stanford University in the Peace Innovation Lab. And I was looking at how financial markets can be used to improve the world, and kind of financial markets as a driver for social good and pro-social behavior.
Just bring that a little bit closer to you. You can move it to you as well. You don't have to get right. It's got a good arm.
So I was a researcher in the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford University.
Okay. And
my research was focused on how financial markets could drive pro-social interaction and make the world a better place. My project there was called Peace Markets, and that brought me to studying Bitcoin and open source, open standard, decentralized internet money networks, and I was fascinated. And then when I started meeting people working in it, I wanted to work in it with them.
So how long had you been at the Peace Innovation Lab when you stepped into Bitcoin?
Yeah, a few years.
Why is it called the Peace Innovation Lab?
It's a lab founded by Mark Nelson and Margarita Kihis that focuses on using Silicon Valley style innovation methods and behavior design and things like that to encourage people to be better to themselves and other people.
That sounds really nice.
Mm-hmm.
Were you drawn to it because of your interest in economics and markets, or were you drawn to it because you're interested in making the world a better place? I see that if you look you up, you can see that you've got a number of projects that seem to relate to your work at the Peace Innovation Lab.
Yeah, I think it was the ability to use my interest in building markets with technology in order to make the world a better place.
So now, do you consider yourself a technology person first, or a markets person first, or something else from a business perspective?
I think of myself as an entrepreneur. I think of myself as a technologist, and I think of myself as a strategist.
So what was your first entrepreneurial project outside of the Peace Innovation Lab? Do you consider that to be an entrepreneurial project?
Absolutely, I do. And we actually did pitch some VCs about spinning it out, but it ended up not happening. My first entrepreneurial project, when I was a kid, my dad bought a lawnmower and made me mow the lawn. And I started renting my lawnmower to my friends so that they could mow the old ladies' lawns in the neighborhood and make money.
So that's
And
great. You managed to make a business out of, and you didn't have to do any of the hard lawn mowing work.
it was very much like Tom Sawyer, get people to paint the fence.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Okay, so where'd you grow up, by the way?
I moved around a lot. I lived in Southern California, Northern Virginia, Atlanta. I used to joke that I kind of grew up in the United Lounge.
Wow. So were you an Army brat or?
No, my dad just gets bored easily.
Okay, that's sounds like it's one of the main features I've seen in many of the entrepreneurs. You can call it getting bored easily or just finding interesting things to work on, but all the successful ones seem to have that trait. So,
Well, my dad's kind of what you would call an intrapreneur, where he's always worked, or not always, but he's worked mostly for very large enterprises, like large technology companies like Hewlett-Packard, or large governments like the state of Georgia. And he's helped them use technology to restructure themselves and to innovate.
now, did you learn about technology through your father, or was it just something that you gravitated to naturally on your own?
I'd say I gravitated to it naturally on my own.
Okay. When did you start with technology? How old were you?
It's an interesting question. So we had, we had Apple IIs at school pretty early, like first or second grade. And there was that little game with the turtle thing that was kind of both programming and drawing. And then there was, my dad had one of those orange and black Toshiba laptops, and I managed to get games running on that, and that was nice. And then later on, probably closer to third or fourth grade, we had a 386 at home. And my dad traveled a lot, so if I broke it, as long as I fixed it before he got home, I wouldn't get in trouble because my mom never used it. And that thing was running DOS and Windows 3.1. And that's when I learned BASIC. I didn't actually write that many programs in BASIC. I mean, I wrote the same, hello and go to and say hello again and fill the screen with my name until the computer crashes and stuff like that. But mostly I used it to cheat at the game Gorillas.
Okay. It's funny. I had friends. I grew up on the Atari 800. Not grew up, but that was the first computer that we had in the house. And you'd have people come over and show how you can use the phone for the computer, and you can do this programming, and you would get the hello where the page would fill up with a word. And all I could think of is, it never occurred to me as a thing. I was like, wow, you can use a phone. I'm like, I could pick up the phone and use the phone. Why do I need to use a phone for a computer? And this was in 1980 something. So the technology hadn't developed to anywhere near, but I always find it interesting to hear how people that are really technology focused, how it kind of spoke to them. So let's talk about your career arc a little bit. All right. So you're at the Peace Innovation Lab, and
if you want, I can give you kind of from beginning to end. The Peace Innovation Lab was not the beginning of my career.
Okay, well, let's hear it then.
Yeah. When I was 15, I took a summer internship. So when I was 15, I dropped out of high school and went to college. I dropped out of I dropped out of Walton High School. I was a sophomore there, and started as a freshman at Kennesaw State University, and started studying economics.
That happens a lot to high school dropouts, right? They drop out and they go right into college.
I had really good SAT scores and really shitty grades, and Kennesaw had really shitty average SAT scores, and it was a good fit. I had a letter of recommendation from my principal because I think he just wanted to get rid of me.
You're probably smarter than him, right? He didn't like that.
He was a great guy. I would never say anything bad about him. But I was definitely a problem kid. And so while I was at Kennesaw, I interned for the state of Georgia. I wrote the authentication and authorization policy for the state portal.
What does that mean?
Well, when you log into a website and you choose like an email address and a password, that website usually has to store that credential information with your other identity information, like your full name and your social security number and why they're keeping an eye on you and stuff like that. When Georgia launched its portal, the goal was to be able to use one single sign-on thing for everything that you could do with the state. So one single sign-on thing to pay your traffic tickets, the same sign-on to change your address with the DMV, the same sign-on to access your health benefits if you were a Medicaid user, all that stuff. The problem is that government agencies are inherently suspicious and onerous creatures. They don't like dealing with each other at all. They don't like sharing information. They think that every other government agency is corrupt and they're the paragon of virtue. And so the trick was, how could I get people to be able to use the same login information at all of these government agencies without them being afraid of being hacked themselves. And so when I say authentication authorization policy, really it was kind of this single sign-on policy.
Okay, was that something that was common in other states, or did you manage to backdoor that into the state of Georgia first?
Well, it was actually the chief architect of the state of Georgia at the time, Moses Miles, who decided that he wanted to backdoor that in, not me. I was just an intern working for him, and it was my job to figure out how to do it, not to figure out what to do. He was pretty sure he wanted some sort of single sign-on. But we were the second state to launch a statewide portal that you could do everything with the government with. The first was the state of Washington.
Okay. And how old were you when you did that?
Oh, that was the summer I was 15 years old.
All right. What'd you do next?
I dropped out of college.
Okay. Well, it seemed like to work for high school, so I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, and then after dropping out of college, or kind of during dropping out of college, I worked for Sun Microsystems in the marketing department, working on OpenOffice.org. And I started the business development group for OpenOffice.org, and I contributed to the open document format, the standard. And I also consulted a little bit for the state of Massachusetts' work, trying to standardize an open document.
Why'd you drop out of college?
Same reason I dropped out of high school. Bad grades.
Bad grades, really?
Yeah. And I wasn't having fun, and I don't like doing work that's going to get graded and set aside. It's inherently demoralizing.
Now that isn't the kind of answer I expected to hear. Because typically when you have someone that can function at the high level that you were functioning at the age of 15, and they decide not to continue with college, it's because there's something at the heart of what it is that they're being forced to do, and they think they can flourish somewhere else. So how old were you when you went to work for Sun Microsystems?
17.
17. So you had 2 years in college.
Yeah.
And how long were you at Sun Microsystems?
About 2 years.
And then where'd you go after that?
A long string of mostly consulting and contracting roles, working on marketing, PR, strategy, and recruiting, all around the topic of enterprise use of open source software. So I would help big companies figure out how to talk to open source software engineers, how to recruit them, how to keep them happy, how to keep them productive, and how to engage in those communities without pissing everyone off.
So you were essentially priming yourself for all of the issues that you have in Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency community, and the political and technological issues that seem to be popping up a lot now, I'd say, huh?
Yeah, I think that people become entrepreneurs when they've learned something failing at basically every other career path first. And so I had been a Starbucks barista, I had been a waiter at a wine bar, I'd been a bookkeeper at a property management complex, I had done strategy consulting for lawyers about open source software. And so I picked up essential skills from each one of those career paths that led me, I think, to being a reasonable person to hire people and fundraise and set product strategy for a startup.
How'd you end up at Peace Innovation Lab?
My girlfriend at the time left me, and we had been living together for 5 years, and I lost 6 months to recovering from the trauma. And when I woke up, I had significantly less savings, and I was working at the Peace Innovation Lab.
Well, that happens to a lot of people when they break up their relationships, I hear. Okay. And what was your first foray into the Bitcoin universe?
I was working at the Peace Innovation Lab and looking at how we could use Bitcoin to build basically predictions markets, idea futures, stuff like that. And that could be leveraged for peace markets, and also looking at, there was a thing we invented called the MAPI, the minimum acceptable peaceful interaction, and the idea was that could be managed by sensor networks like social networks or Uber or things like that, and that could be monetized, and we were working on that. And Bitcoin seemed like a better basis to do that work than the dollar, because it didn't require teaching banks anything. And teaching banks is extremely difficult and expensive and almost always likely to fail.
You said minimum acceptable peaceful
Interaction.
What's that?
Yeah, so the idea that was popular at the Peace Innovation Lab at the time was that the goal of peace is not the cessation of hostilities. The goal of peace is finding a boundary between two communities that are often hostile and increasing the positive interaction that crosses that boundary. So, for example, we launched a thing with Facebook called peace.facebook.com, where they measured how many Indian people and Pakistani people became friends on Facebook, and how many Israelis and Palestinians became friends on Facebook, and things like that. And so that would be a MAPI, would be a friend request that is accepted, so it's bilateral, peaceful interaction across that conflict boundary.
That's pretty interesting. Was there any actual data in the study as to what drew people closer, or any of those kinds of, I don't know what the word is, interactions? What drove those interactions?
When I say that I was a researcher, I was mostly on the kind of prototyping and design side. I wasn't involved with any of the papers that we published, but a lot of my colleagues were, and that stuff's available on Google Scholar.
Okay, well, pretty interesting. So then, when did you take the plunge?
Into Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Well, in March of 2012, I had been trading Bitcoin for a few months. I had proposed a couple of Bitcoin projects to a friend of mine who was investing, and we had worked together for about a year on exploring one of them. It was actually a Bitcoin mining project, and kind of other things like that. And I went to the Future of Money and Tech conference, and that's where Brian introduced me to Jared Kenna, the guy who started the first Bitcoin exchange in America. And Jared had just bought a 40-bedroom
hotel, right?
Yeah, the word hotel is generous. It was a 40-bedroom something. And
former slum?
Something.
Or tenement?
Yeah, so in San Francisco, they called them, I forget, there's SROs.
Oh, okay. That's
single room occupancy. Yeah, that's right. But it was an SRO that had been abandoned for 18 years and didn't have a residency permit at the time. So it was an entrepreneurial activity. And I hit it off with Jared, and I moved into that place, which we ended up calling 20 Mission. And I helped him get it renovated and legal to live in and profitable. And that was my first company that I started with Jared. And then the second one was the company that became Trade Hill that we were on the documentary for.
Was the name of the company 20 Mission?
20mission.com.
Okay. All right. And so you were back to property managing again.
Yeah, except for that it was like a dorm for 20-something entrepreneurs.
Right.
Whereas my first property managing job was a 430-bedroom campus for 20-year-old undergraduate students in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Sounds like that one might have been more work than the one in San Francisco.
It was definitely different work.
Less fun, perhaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you started working in, let's say, Trade Hill 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were the COO, correct?
Yeah, I was the president and I was the COO, and I also worked closely with the engineering staff.
And well, I think we already kind of described that. What did you? And at some point, Trade Hill shut down as well, correct? Trade Hill 2.
Yeah. So what happened was we had a banking relationship with the Internet Archive Federal Credit Union that was started by Brewster Kahle of the Internet Archive. and they were banking our users in there using our platform. And they ran into some trouble with the regulator for working with us, which I thought was ridiculous at the time because we had a very buttoned up regulatory shop. But the National Credit Union Authority decided that they didn't want this Bitcoin stuff in the world. And the way that banking regulation works is if your examiner is not your best friend as a bank, then you're not a bank anymore. And
Yes.
and so that's what happened is the examiner was trying to encourage the Internet Archive Federal Credit Union to stop working with us. The Internet Archive Federal Credit Union was trying to encourage the examiner to think of all of the people that Bitcoin could help, and they agreed to disagree. And after the bank died, it was impossible for us to get another bank, and so we shut the company down about 6 months later.
That must have been pretty hard.
Yeah, it definitely did not make me a bigger fan of the banking system and the regulators that they've captured.
I would imagine. So that bank was actually shut down.
Yeah.
By the regulators. Wow.
No, well, I mean, the bank was shut down by the bank under pressure from the regulators.
Okay, so it was shut down either way for having Bitcoin related business.
It was shut down for using Bitcoin related business to improve their community in the world.
Yeah, that's got to be pretty disheartening for a tech entrepreneur like you.
I think that you learn from all of these things, and whatever doesn't kill you can cripple you for life.
That's very Nietzschean. That's true. So now you're at the Chia Network.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm sure you did a whole bunch of other interesting things, but let's talk a little bit about the Chia Network. Last year, you announced that you guys would be ready in the spring/summer of 2019 to kind of start rolling things out, right?
Yeah.
So before we talk about that, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Chia Network? I know that it does something with farming.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So while I was working at Tradell in 2013, Bram Cohen, the guy who invented BitTorrent, sent me a Facebook message. And what he said was, I've avoided it so far because speculative markets piss me off. But someone I really respect told me I needed to take a close personal look at Bitcoin. So could you bring one of your engineers and come into my office and explain Bitcoin to me? So at the time, I took my CTO of Tradell, and we spent about 2 hours explaining to Bram the Bitcoin mining game and Bitcoin signatures and Bitcoin transactions and the Bitcoin networking model and all of those things. And that began his 4 years worth of research into, can we do something that's as cool as Bitcoin without burning all of the electricity we can get our hands on and cooking the earth?
Why would we want to use just a ton of electricity, really? But doesn't it safeguard the network?
So it really does, actually. That's the interesting thing about Bitcoin, the kind of invention that made it work, is this thing called Nakamoto consensus. And it's this thing that we know of as proof of work, where if you and I waste resources in order to do leader election to figure out who can add to the chain, then anybody else who joins can look at competing chains and know which one wasted more resources, and that's the one that they treat as valid. And this actually is a pretty incredible thing for Bitcoin, because what it means is you can destroy half the network, the other half will survive. You can double the size of the network, it'll automatically adjust. You can partition it into two and then heal the partition, and it'll heal. The two will run separately until you heal the partition, and then it'll heal. Nakamoto consensus allows there to be a central bank of the internet without there being a central banker of the internet, with the internet just having this emergent order that it does on the networking layer as well. And so that was a pretty incredible invention, and what Bram had to do in order to design what would become Chia is he had to reinvent how do you get that same exact set of properties. How do you get Nakamoto consensus in a way where you're comparing something else and not how much electricity you've wasted? And what he realized is you have to waste something, but If you can find a way to prove that you're wasting something that everybody else already wastes anyway, then it doesn't have to be new waste to humanity. And that's how he came up with with the concept of proof of space and time, where proof of space is just hard disk space, which is already massively over-provisioned. We have at least twice as much hard disk space deployed in the world as we have useful data stored on disks. And then proof of time is this kind of technical hack that ends up making it work just like Bitcoin's proof of work.
Can you explain that to someone who's an idiot?
It's very difficult to do.
Okay.
But lucky for you, I have a lot of experience talking to lawyers.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, Bitcoin's mining is a lottery game. You take your ASIC, which is a lottery ticket printer, and you plug it into electricity, and it converts that electricity into as many lottery tickets as it can. It just piles them up on the desk. And what the network does is it checks each of those lottery tickets. And every 10 minutes, somebody has a lottery ticket that's a winner, and all of the other lottery tickets during those 10 minutes are losers. And it's a simple, cheap check on every ticket to see if it's a winner or not, and you just keep checking them until you find one. And that's the person who gets to sign the next block. With farming, how it works is you fill up your hard.
And by the way, there you're talking about the hash, getting a Bitcoin hash, right?
So
Just now.
hashing is how you create the lottery ticket in Bitcoin. So you have the block that has the hash of all of the transactions, and you have that in what's called a Merkle tree, which is just a tree of hashes where you hash two things into one thing, and if you just do that on a bunch of things, you can form a structure that looks like an upside-down tree, where there's a root at the top, and then there's a bunch of leaves on the bottom.
Okay.
The way that you print a lottery ticket in Bitcoin is one of those leaves is a number called a nonce, a number used only once. And every time you change that number, you change the root. And so they just set a threshold for how many zeros are in the front of the root. The more zeros you need, the more rare it is. And then they cycle through the nonces until they get to a winning lottery ticket. And so you might have to hash a bajillion things before you get a winning block.
Okay.
So with Chia, instead of printing lottery tickets until you find a winner, you print as many bingo cards as you can fit on your disk, and you store them in sorted order on the disk. And then every time the network calls a number, every time somebody finds a block, you look at your disk for your closest bingo card to that number, and you can use that to calculate the difficulty of the proof of time you would have to do to solve the next block. So if your bingo card is super close, maybe it would take you a couple minutes. If your bingo card is super far away, maybe it will take you a few hours. And so it's only really worth the network doing proofs of time on the very few bingo cards that are closest to the next block. So it kind of creates the same situation as proof of work in that replacing the blockchain with a heavier blockchain takes just as much time and more space, or takes just as much space and more time, which is nice. It means that you get all of the benefits of Nakamoto consensus. But the thing that people waste to win more often is disk space, which is something that they're already wasting and it's just sitting there depreciating, and that they've already over deployed, which is really nice. We think that the deployed disk space globally is much more decentralized than cheap electricity is, or much more decentralized than Bitcoin ASICs are. And also, wasting your disk space in a particular way costs you no more money than wasting it just as free space. So it's one of those nice things where if you already have the disk space, you can farm it for free. But if you're buying or renting disk space for the purpose of farming, you're at a disadvantage to the people who are farming what they already have.
All right, so let's just touch base about disk space so that I make sure I can understand that. Disk space, I've got a tablet right here, right? I've got 256 gigabytes on it. Is that the disk space you're talking about?
Yeah, so out of your 256 gigabytes of space on your tablet, probably 50 of it is used up by the apps and the operating system and and the games and everything you do.
Right.
And then sometimes you fill up the rest with movies that you're making, that you're editing, and sometimes you don't. The disk space that's currently empty, the disk space that is free, that's what you can use to farm.
And so when someone wants to offer up disk space on the Chia network?
I wouldn't think of it as offering it up. Nobody is putting stuff in your disk space. You're not telling people how much you have. What you're doing is you're printing a bunch of bingo cards and filling it up yourself, so that when the network calls a number, you can check your bingo cards yourself to see what your closest proof of space is.
And when you, let's say you get, my tablet has the next number, right? The closest.
Then just like in Bitcoin, you're the winner who gets to decide which transactions are in the next block, and you get a block reward.
Okay. And because you're looking at disk space and the amount of theoretical, the amount of time is really, it's theoretical. You can calculate it, but because you're looking at the amount of time, you don't have to do the calculation and burn the energy. Is that essentially
proof of time is a process that a CPU burns energy on. It's kind of, think of it as a sequential proof of work where you do one step at a time, where the answer to the previous question is needed to answer the next question. So the thing about proof of time is doing it more than once in parallel doesn't help you. Your fastest thread is the only thread that you have. And the whole network doesn't need that many proofs of time because they gossip about proofs of space. So the work that most farmers do is just setting up their proof of space up front.
Mm-hmm.
And then the work that the whole network does is just adding time to those proofs of space. But it's not really more expensive from an electricity perspective to farm Chia on a device that's already on than it is just to have that device on.
Why is that? That's what I'd like to get
because the computer is just doing a few disk lookups on the disk once a block every few minutes. And then just uploading that very small space proof of space to the other computers, and someone who has a fast proof of time server will see it and go, "Oh, that's better than the other ones I have," and solve time on that instead.
Okay, so the time is actually being solved, but it's not electricity intensive.
Yeah, so if there are 5 or 10 people solving time in the whole world, that's enough for the network to be something that everybody in the world uses.
Gotcha. My camera just went off, so hold on. We can keep talking, but I just want to fix this. Okay.
Proof of space is kind of the hero that does leader election. Proof of time is just this thing that happens in the background that adds security. But you would only really run a proof of time server if you wanted to keep the other proofs of time servers honest. So the same type of people who would run a full node all the time, people who run exchanges, people who run mining pools or farming pools in our case, those would be the people who run proofs of time server. But every farmer does not need to run one. Farmers just need space.
Gotcha. So essentially what it sounds like it's doing is it's dedicated entities are going to be doing the underlying work, and it's making use of
I wouldn't
space.
I wouldn't focus too much on the proof of time.
Okay.
The work that matters is the proof of space. The proof of time is just a thing that adds security to it. But the proof of time is not something that lots of people do, and it's not something that it matters who does it, and it's not something that gets paid.
Gotcha. All right. Okay. So that's the Chia solution to the Bitcoin electricity burning.
Mm-hmm. So what you end up with is the Chia network at, a massive scale. If it was bigger than MasterCard, say, it would only use as much electricity as any other popular website that had hundreds of servers. So, for example, the website Reddit or the website Google.
Right. Oh, interesting. So how long did it take Bram to figure that out?
About 4 years. It was in spring of 2017 that he reached back out and said, I want to start my digital money company. What do I do? And I told him, well, you have to quit your job at BitTorrent and start a company, and you're probably going to need a co-founder, and then we're going to go out and raise money, and I'd be happy to be your co-founder.
How long have you been with Chia for?
Since about 3 months before founding.
What was it? When was it founded?
August of 2017.
So it's kind of new, but for the space, it's not as well. I mean, for a company that's founded in 2017, it's made a lot of waves and made a lot of news. But there's plenty of newer companies that are in the FinTech world that give you guys a unique spot on the ecosystem.
Well, we've written some cool software. We've had to invent some cool mathematics. We designed a way to use class groups, which is an old thing in math, in order to do better proofs of time. And that allows us to do proofs of time without a trusted setup, which is something that Ethereum is struggling with right now. And yeah, I mean, basically, we raise money, we talk at conferences, we publish academic papers, we write code, and we pay lawyers and accountants to talk to us about bullshit regulatory stuff.
Well, yeah, sure. Everyone has to do that here now, right? Unfortunately. So let's talk a little bit about something we were talking about before we sat down, or before we started recording, which was blockchain versus Bitcoin, and your thoughts on that. It's kind of a list of, it seems like, some of your pet peeves after being in the industry for as long as you have, and seeing all of the craziness that we've seen.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that Bitcoin is the killer app for blockchain. The idea of Nakamoto consensus was the core invention that led people to talk about blockchain in the first place. And what it's really good for is having a shared money database that doesn't have an operator and can't be shut down and can easily heal partitions and things like that. I'm not sure I've seen a second use case for blockchain yet at all. And Chia is just trying to be a better digital money that also uses Nakamoto consensus, but uses it in a less wasteful way, and perhaps uses it in a more functional way. Almost every time I hear the word blockchain, not Bitcoin, what someone's describing is, if we used computers that were networked together that could all access the same database, then the thing that we were doing would be less stupid. And that's true for basically any business and any business process. And that's been true since we started linking intranets together into the internet in the 1980s. There was some work in the 60s and 70s too. But basically, what they're just saying is that they want to have a web service with a database. And using the word blockchain as a marketing term when describing things like that, which includes a lot of things in FinTech, includes a lot of things in supply chain, includes a lot of things in a lot of things. When you use the word blockchain for that, what you're doing really is you're taking the hype around the truly revolutionary things happening in Bitcoin, and to a lesser extent Ethereum, and you're using that hype, and you're using that interest, and you're using that wealth creating opportunity in order to promote something that's significantly less interesting or exciting.
So I'm going to challenge you on that for certain things, because I do agree that blockchain is overhyped. Like, what was it? Long Island, there was some sort of Long Island drink company.
Iced tea.
It was Long Island iced tea. Okay. That changed their name to Long Island Blockchain or something like that. And their stock shot up and they got fined by the SEC. That happened, I think it was in 2017 when that happened,
yeah,
or 2018. So I do agree that there's definitely a hype to the word blockchain.
So I have a friend that started a company that uses the blockchain that uses a blockchain to track sneakers. I started a company that used Bitcoin and related technologies to make it easier to secure the supply chain for trial data for clinical trials. I worked with Merck on that one. I started another company that just helped banks talk to each other to do more real-time gross settlement of trades. And because we were using Bitcoin and related technologies for it, we called that blockchain clearing. In all of these cases, it's the database that's doing the heavy lifting. And it was just easier to market these things because we were cargo culting Bitcoin.
I see. So well, let me give you an example, because I do hear what you're saying, but commercial mortgage-backed securities or residential mortgage-backed securities.
So
it's a data mess.
It is a data mess. And it would be better if these things were centrally cleared and centrally tracked, and basically if there was a database instead of bilateral messaging. And that would be great. And if you had a database like that, sure, you can cryptographically secure it by using a PKI identity model to access it, and by using hashes in between. And all of those technologies existed in, 1992, and were used for stuff like this in 1992, and would be used for stuff like this now, even if Bitcoin had never been created or anything like that. And the word blockchain is a bullshit marketing hype way to talk about it.
Well,
unless what you want to do with these mortgage-backed securities is have them issued on a completely peer-to-peer basis by non-bank institutions that are just your friends lending to you on a network that would be difficult to take down by arresting thousands of people, where nobody was applying for licenses and nobody was tracking each other's identities. And if you really wanted to do it like Bitcoin, then I would be less accusing of bullshit. But I believe everybody trying to do this is actually just trying to create a platform for banks to talk to each other better. And they're using the word blockchain because the banks like hearing the word blockchain because they're terrified of Bitcoin.
Well, I do agree with that last statement that they are terrified of Bitcoin. But so here's how I see the value for actually using a blockchain for something like when you have a large pool of data. The fact that the immutability is important because
Okay.
you do need a record. You need a record of when there's a default in payment. You need a record that everyone can see so that it can't be disputed.
So let's unpack this stuff for a second. Yeah. What do you mean when you say the word blockchain, and what do you mean when you say the word immutable?
Okay, so here we go. Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that
I'm getting at that Bitcoin can't be used for large amounts of data, and that every other blockchain system that you've heard described as a blockchain system has lesser claims to being immutable. And that small
That's
blocks
correct.
is part of what make Bitcoin immutable, which means that to the degree that the word blockchain describes technology in any way whatsoever, it's very bad for that use case in particular of tracking large amounts of data.
I have to think about that for a second, but it sounds like you might be right about that, which wouldn't surprise me. And to your point, I think the point that you were getting at is that if you're using a private blockchain, it's going to be administered. So immutable is relative, right?
The word private blockchain is just a way to say the word database when you get your VC valuations up, and is in no way different than anything Oracle sold in the 90s.
Either silence because I'm thinking about that, and perhaps there's some truth to it.
That said, Oracle's a great company, and there are very important uses for shared databases in almost every business world. And it's not actually a terrible thing if the business world moves to using more shared databases. It's just not a reasonable way to avoid talking about Bitcoin's effect on the banking system.
I'm not sure I understand the correlation between the first part and the last part.
The reason people talk about blockchain,
right,
is because they want to talk about the answer to Bitcoin. They want to say, I'm a fan of blockchain but not cryptocurrency. Or they want to say, I'm a fan of blockchain but not Bitcoin. Because this invention of Nakamoto consensus can drive internet consensus around using digital money without there being something to shut down is inherently threatening to the fact that the financial industry is one of the largest industries in most countries on earth, and it gets that way through a monopoly on the use of digital cash. So if a monopoly on the use of digital cash is no longer possible, and businesses and people can transact with each other without lending money to a bank, that's extraordinarily threatening to our way of life in general. And that's why it's super important for banks to say why they think blockchain is more important than Bitcoin. It's really just a slander campaign dressed up as a venture capital movement.
Wow, that's some serious. That's a serious thing to say. I'm just trying to. I'm thinking about it, and look, there's no doubt that Bitcoin really is a potential threat to the financial system, in certain ways. When you look at it from an anti-money laundering perspective, I think we've all seen it could be good and bad. If you can, once you know who the
It's going to be at least 50 years until Bitcoin's a better money laundering platform than Bank of America.
Right, which is, I think, the large part of the issue from a governmental perspective. as to what drives some of the regulatory concerns that people at FinCEN have.
I've spoken a lot to regulators in the space. I think that law enforcement's pretty comfortable at this point with digital currencies and how they can investigate them and how they can use them. Like I said, it's a lot harder to investigate money laundering at banks than it is at Bitcoin exchanges. So law enforcement's still mostly focused on the actual criminals, which for the most part use banks, not Bitcoin, because
And the
banks,
U.S. dollar.
Yeah, well, the U.S. $100 bill is the official currency of the black market everywhere, and there's not a single city on earth in which Bitcoin is used for more illegal transactions than the $100 bill is. Not in Africa, not in Asia. The U.S. $100 bill is the currency of crime, and Bitcoin may never replace it.
I agree with you on that. I was listening to, I don't know if it was, I don't want to say the name because it may be the wrong person, but somebody was saying that the reason why it was someone with an economics bent was saying that the reason why the U.S. dollar has been the currency of the world for the last, I don't know if it's since the 70s or if it's
since World War II. So the United States conquered the world in World War II. We
Yes,
either
we did.
allied with every country on earth or we defeated the others that we didn't ally with, and we did it mostly by main strength. And the loot that we got, the prize that we got from landing that war, there's this phrase, to the victor go the spoils. The prize that we got was every other country on earth had to use our currency as their main forex pair. And that system was called Bretton Woods, and it meant that you can't buy euros with yen. You use yen to buy dollars to buy euros. And so because of that, all international trade had to go through our financial system, and everybody out there that wanted to buy things for import had to find a way to buy dollars first. And that's what dollars are.
What about the peg to oil, the pegging oil to U.S. dollar? Do you think that had something to do with the primacy of the U.S. dollar?
I think it's the other way. I think they had to peg oil to the dollar because the dollar was the mandatory currency for international trade. So either you could say we're going to value oil in the currency of all of the oil-producing countries,
which would be difficult to
which would be
track.
a lot of quotes, or you say we're just going to value oil against the dollar because that if you're in Europe and you want to buy oil from Iraq, you have to buy dollars anyway. Just like if you're in Europe and you want to buy hummus from Iraq, you have to buy dollars anyway. That's what we won in World War II.
Right. You know what? That's why I do this. I learn all sorts of stuff. I try to talk to people that are smarter than me only. So I want to go back to one of the things that you were talking about with Bitcoin as a threat to the U.S. banking system. If the U.S. or if monetary, well, let's just say banks in general, not the financial systems, let's say. So is the threat that you believe the banks perceive pegged to the fact that the governments would not be able to regulate inflation?
No.
Is it?
No.
What is it pegged to?
So
I shouldn't use the word pegged, but
yeah, there's the word pegged is a loaded word when you're
Yeah.
talking about currency in general, and it's usually a dumb word because pegs are generally a sign that a central bank is immature and inexperienced and about to be taught a lesson by the investment banks of the world. What's his name? Soros made his fortune originally betting that the UK could not maintain their peg. And that's why he became known as the man who broke the Bank of England, because basically what he did was he borrowed as much money as he could in the UK, getting people to let them borrow money against their houses and their commercial buildings and their businesses and all sorts of stuff. And then he just sold those pounds to invest in Germany and France and the US and places like that to buy the exact same kinds of assets. So it created a position where he was just short all the pounds and long all of the other developed market currencies. And the Bank of England ran out of their foreign currency reserves, buying up the pounds that he was selling to try and keep the peg. And once they ran out, they had no ability to buy pounds anymore. They only had the ability to sell them because they could print them, so they could always sell them. But they had to buy them with other stuff. And the British government basically ran out of money to buy pounds. And then the currency started floating again, and the peg was defeated, and he became a billionaire.
It's not a very nice way to become a billionaire.
But it's what everybody who studies monetary policy thinks about when they hear the word peg.
Okay, well, there you go. So
It's also what they think about when they hear the word backed. Same thing.
as in backed by gold.
Backed by gold means you're willing to sell gold to buy the thing back. That's all
Right.
it means.
I'm just trying to see. Well, I understand what you're saying, I think. So banks being threatened by Bitcoin. What's
Banks
it coming
being-
from?
Yeah. So if I wanted to send you money on Square Cash, or I wanted to pay your law firm's legal bill, your law firm is special actually because I believe you guys accept Bitcoin for your bills. But if you didn't,
Right.
then if I wanted to pay your legal bill, I'm not actually going to be able to conveniently pay it with cash because my business is in San Francisco and your accounting office is in Kansas City. And so for me to pay it with cash, I'm going to have to put cash in a briefcase, hop on a plane, deliver the cash there, and get a receipt from you guys, and then come home. And I'd have to do that whole thing without getting mugged. And by the way, you're not allowed to carry that much cash on airplanes. It's actually illegal.
$10,000, right?
Yeah, and you're lawyers, so you bill more than that.
Depends on the matter, right?
Yeah, just on interesting matters, you always bill more than that.
Right, right.
And so how I pay you instead is I send you a banking payment, like a bill pay or a wire or a check or a direct deposit,
Right.
right? And all of those are not actually sending you cash because I don't have cash at the bank. What I have is the bank owes me money, and the first $250,000 of that is insured by the FDIC, and the rest is not.
Correct.
And the bank is only required to keep 10% of the money they owe as cash. Everything else is just money that they owe.
Correct.
That's backed by assets that they can sell.
Correct. Often loans. Yes.
Often
Stock. But
stock, loans,
there's a lot of
derivative agreements, other forms of collateral. I've seen banks have houses. I've seen banks have motorcycles.
as collateral for loans, you mean?
But then they
ownership.
seize the collateral, and now it's an asset.
That's correct.
and they
then
still
have to
owe
sell
money
it.
to their depositors.
Yeah.
So during that time before they sell it, the deposits are backed by the motorcycle.
That's true. You're absolutely right.
So that means that at any given time, the stability of the system is only really guaranteed by the idea that only 10% or less of the cash is going to get withdrawn.
Right.
If ever there's a run on the American banking system, like what happened in Cyprus in 2012 or 2013, while we were running Trado, that where people want to demand more than 10% of the bank's assets from ATMs or from teller windows, then the whole thing goes poof like a house of cards. That's called run on the bank. The nice thing about digital money that's not banking digital money, that's instead like open source, decentralized, distributed digital money, the thing that we mean when we say the word blockchain and we're not full of shit, is that's just a cash-like asset. And you can set rules around it, like you said, around your bank account. You can say who's allowed to spend it, who's not, who's allowed to receive it, who's not, how fast can it be spent, what are the rules for asking for a refund. All of those rules can be set on things like Chia or Bitcoin or Ethereum. They're actually easier to set with Chia. But at the end of the day, it's the actual money that moves, not the fact that the bank owes you something. So this is a lot better because it means there's not a difference between Chia I give you and Chia someone else gives you. Whereas there sure as hell is a difference between Citibank dollars and JP Morgan dollars. Because
it's only 10% of it?
Well, because Citibank and JP Morgan could go bankrupt separately. One of them could go bankrupt and the other stays, in which case there's a big difference between their dollars. They're not fungible anymore.
And so, right. So when you say JP Morgan and Citibank dollars, what you're really talking about, so that I'm following you, is that the money that
The electronic
account holders.
The electronic balances of the money that those banks owe you.
That's correct. Right. Well said. Thank you, sir. And so, all right. So Chase has a whole bunch of electronic money in let's say in fiat, right? It's electronic fiat, we'll call it.
Well, I mean, again, the word fiat is confusing here because the cash in my wallet is fiat and it's 100% reserve ratio. And the money in my Chase account is fiat and it's 10% reserve ratio. And these are not the same thing.
That is true. That hence the FDIC $250,000 limit that you discussed.
Which is only enough to protect consumers. Businesses that employ even half a dozen people will often go through more or less than that as they have revenue and expenses.
So it sounds like the picture you're drawing about the reasons for the bank not liking Bitcoin is because they lose their ability to have a 90% float.
Bitcoin came out in 2009 as a reaction to 2008. What happened in 2008 is an entire generation of humans realized that the banks are fallible and could die. And this is the first time that had happened since America conquered the world in World War II and got everyone else to use our banking system. And so this idea that banks are vulnerable and could die, that we all learned in 2008 because we saw all of the banks almost die.
I mean, didn't we learn it in 1929 too?
Sure. But in 2008, I was alive and we spent $1 trillion
right,
making it not happen.
And I personally think the reason why all that money was spent to stop the banks from going bust was because of the deposits. I know a lot of people talk about the stockholders, but it's just my own personal belief, but I think that the reason why there was so much concern really did relate to the run on the banks and people losing their money if the banks went away.
I think that's absolutely right. What we had was a situation where most of the largest banks in the country had more liabilities than assets. And the government had to step in and fix that situation in order for the banks to be able to service their liabilities. And for the most part, the bank's liabilities were deposits.
Right. And, you know, when you look at the classical economic theories, stuff that Thomas Sowell talks about and Milton Friedman talked about, letting Chrysler die because it was a bad company in the late 70s and early 80s, I think it's harder to do that with banks because of the customer deposit issue.
Only because there's this idea that customer deposits are cash and therefore sacred. If we called those customer deposits bonds, then it would be easier to do.
I think you're right. And if we called them bonds, I also think that you would have less people putting money in banks. Don't you?
I do.
I wouldn't. If I took my money and put it in the bank and then you called it a bond, I would say, no. I'll put it under my mattress or wherever I would put it.
It is a bond. It's a bond where the first $250,000 is insured and the rest is not. But the whole thing pays interest, but the interest sucks.
Yes, it certainly does. The last time it didn't suck was right before the crash, I think, too, right? That was the ING 5% deposit return or something like that. That was supposed to be the best you could get at that time. So I follow everything that you're saying so far, and I agree with everything you're saying. What I want to distill from you is what you see the threat Bitcoin is to the banks. Is it that because they have this float?
What if your firm could pay all of your people and could take money from all of your clients and could buy all of its stuff without loaning a bank money? But it could do it with the same level of security that you're used to from using banks, with the same level of liquidity you're used to from using banks, the same ability to borrow, you have the same ability to spend, you have the same ability to account. What if the only difference was you didn't have to loan money to a bank to use the banking system?
Then you would need the banking system.
Well, no, I mean, Bitcoin and Chia is a banking system. It's just not a banking system where we think bonds are cash. It's a system where there's a very big difference between bonds and cash.
And when I say you wouldn't need a banking system, I meant you wouldn't need a bank itself.
You wouldn't need the current banks how they're currently done. You still would need places to borrow money from, and those places would still be very good issuers of bonds. They just wouldn't call them deposits, and they wouldn't be used for payments.
You've given me a lot to think about. These are not readily apparent points, and there's a lot of There's a lot of stuff that feels real in them. So I'm going to have to ruminate on some of this a little more. So let's go to some other stuff that we were talking about. AI, right?
Yeah, so my wife is a machine learning engineer and a data scientist, and so I kind of defer to her and stuff like this. But from my conversations with her and also with my co-founder Bram, who's a pretty serious technologist, it seems pretty clear that most of the time when people say AI, they're referring to one of three things. One is robots in movies and television shows.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Two is normal software that is in no way comparable to an animal's intelligence.
True, yeah.
And three are things called machine learning algorithms that can acquire experience and apply experience to a data set, but don't think outside of that deterministic thing, and don't have any particular creativity or engagement in any way. So, for example, a computer vision system that has been showed 10,000 copies of a cat and now can tell you when something looks like those 10,000 copies of a cat. And generally, when something looks like 10,000 pictures of a cat, it's either a cat or a picture of a cat.
Right. Good point. Good point about that. So another overused term, I guess, right?
Another over-romanticized term that's become not useful because the myths in people's minds about it are unrelated to the uses of the technologies that originally inspired those myths.
There are a lot of people that talk about AI, and I just find it completely ridiculous. You know, they say that it's going to be able to do all of these things, and I'm just not convinced. You know, I've been hearing apocryphal tales of all sorts of, or I should say apocalyptic tales about what's going to happen for years, and just every time I think about it, and I don't see anything to justify it.
Well, when you hear all of these things, one of the interesting things about technology in capitalism is the purpose of technology in capitalism is to destroy jobs. That's what it's for. For example, imagine a factory with 50 seamstresses that are all making jeans. And now imagine a factory that has sewing machines that have 5 seamstresses that make 100 times as many jeans, and there's one mechanic that fixes the sewing machines when they break. That's what technology is, and that's what capital is, and that's what productivity is, and that's what growth is. So the goal of software is to allow a computer to do a thing that a human used to do. That's what software's for. And every time we successfully do that, the whole world gets a little bit richer. And
I agree with that.
Yeah, so the goal of technology in general is to destroy jobs, and we'll be done destroying jobs when all of the things we want to consume are free.
Which will never happen.
That's right. But televisions are a lot cheaper than they used to be. So are cars, so are tables.
Clothing.
Basically everything that's not provided by a government-administered cartel is cheaper than it used to be. And this is because technology has destroyed jobs.
Who's your favorite economist?
I like Brian Kaplan. I like Tyler Cohen. I like Milton Friedman.
Do you read any economic books?
Brian Kaplan had a recent one, The Case Against Education, where he argues that the sheepskin effect is making us all poorer. He also had another good one that was very pro-natalist. That was The Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. It basically talked about how parenting is pointless and kids are all great, so just parent less and breed more and everyone will be happier.
I like that. I would love to parent less, but I think my wife would probably divorce me if I did. So there you
It's
go.
okay.
That's right.
So, yeah, I mean, I kind of like just core microeconomic analysis that throws out traditional assumptions. That's generally what I enjoy most. And Milton Friedman was one of the first people to do that with regard to monetary policy. And Brian Kaplan does that to kind of whatever the fuck he wants. And that's something I enjoy reading.
I'm gonna have to read those books. That sounds really interesting. I've recently stepped into economics because I've realized that it gives us answers to questions that are in the public discourse a lot of late. And I've found Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman to be wonderful bastions of light and clarity in a world that is often confusing. It feels like almost intentionally.
If it helps, just remember there's no one in charge.
So you've had quite a career arc. How much of your success has been goal-directed?
I am extraordinarily good at failing upwards, and I think you'll find that's true of basically any entrepreneur.
Failing upwards. That's a great term. Did you just make that up?
No.
Okay. What's it from?
I have no idea.
All right. So, opportunistic seems like is a good way to describe your success.
I work hard. I read a lot. I try things that I'm not sure if they'll work. I'd say I'm opportunistic. I'd say that I'm mercenary. I'd say that I'm driven. But mostly I'm just lucky. And I think you'll find that that a tremendous amount of economic success is luck. And it's very important that society allows luck to happen. And it's very important that society allows capital to accumulate, because that's the only way that we'll get enough capital to make everything cheaper and get rid of all the jobs.
What do you think about universal basic income?
Like every other government policy, there are two things to think about, right? What's the effect that it has when you do it, and how do you pay for it? In general, most of the time people are arguing for broad social safety net programs. The reason that they want it is because they experience compassion for people who are suffering, which is good.
It's a good thing, yeah.
And the way that they want to pay for it is by making capital accumulate slower, which is bad because it means there's less stuff for us to use to alleviate suffering. Remember, you can't eat money.
And it also demotivates you.
Oh, no, I don't even care about the motivation from this perspective. Capital accumulation is what builds the things that we consume.
Correct.
T-shirts are made in factories that use machinery. Food is made on farms that use machinery. Software that does spell check is the reason that you can do your business with only one associate instead of 4. Software that does search is the reason you can do your business with only one associate instead of 4. In fact, law firms are a great example of how technology has changed the world just in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, at a big law firm such as Postinelli, there would be 5 associates for every one partner.
That's
and they
right.
would do research, they would do drafting, they would do review, they would do editing, and the partner would sit above all of it as the lord in the castle and occasionally tell an associate that he was an idiot for doing something wrong. Now, I have more partners on my account at Postinelli than I have associates. In fact, I think the ratio is almost entirely the other way, like 5 partners to every associate. Maybe not that much, but close.
The models are changing in law firms, yeah.
And the reason for this is because any law firm that spends time drafting something that they already have a template on is a stupid law firm and is going to go out of business. Anytime a law firm has someone do copy editing before they've done spell check, it's a stupid law firm that's going to go out of business. Anytime they have someone do extensive legal research in a library that has books before they've done a search on LexisNexis and on Google, is a stupid law firm that's going to go out of business.
I can't tell you the last time I used to do research one of the ones you pay for. I use basic internet research, which is excellent now at getting you the cases you need to analyze. Sometimes you have to go in deep, but I haven't had to log in with a code to do any work in years, and I'm very happy about that.
So what you're basically saying is, for your job, Google is more relevant than LexisNexis.
That's exactly right.
I think that's fair. There have been billions and billions and billions of dollars of resources put into building that software at Google that not only helps you do your job, but also powers my cell phone and helps everybody else do their jobs. If instead of putting that money into making Google better, we gave that money to poor people to buy food, we would feel good because we would see the direct benefit of poor people buying food. But we would also still have to employ many more associates as the slaves of you and your colleagues at work. And so the whole idea that the purpose of capital accumulation is to become more productive, to destroy jobs, to make all of the things we consume, all of the goods and services we consume, more affordable for everyone, is something that can only happen to the extent that we allow capital accumulation, that we allow investment with the hope of a return. And so any program where the goal is to satisfy our need to show compassion, which I agree is a very important goal, and then the thing we give up is capital accumulation, what we're doing is we're betting against the future every time. And I think that the compassion would actually be better served by betting on the future.
That's a wonderful way to debunk so much of the socialism that you see popping up everywhere. I look at it a slightly different way, but less eloquent, I would say. But the fact of the matter is that what the basis of capitalism is that you own your own labor. It's yours, and you can do things with it. And the motivating force for everything that's made the world better has been the selfish benefit that you get from making something, doing something, and getting profit from it. And
so I hear you. I think that argument, which is very common among Republicans, is ignores some basic truths, right? Municipal governments are very important. Humanity lives in cities now. Over half of humans live in cities, large cities.
The entire world, the majority of the entire world now, right?
Yeah, over half of humans.
You said over half, so yeah.
Over half of humans live in large cities. And the city can invest and make the whole city better off, oftentimes by lowering the cost of medical care and subsidizing the cost of medical care for some people. And so public health feels like socialism, but is actually investment. Better policing can feel like socialism, but is actually better investment in property norms. Better fire control feels like socialism, but is actually better investment in the fact that fires spread like diseases do. There are a lot of education feels like socialism, but actually results in more people who have the ability to think about investment and invest their personal resources better, which can increase more things. So I think there are a lot of things that conservatives think of as welfare programs that can be trimmed back that actually encourage capital accumulation more than they tax it. And capital accumulation is the goal here. That's what allows society to get richer. That's what allows us to have cheaper T-shirts and cheaper sandwiches and better Googles. So I think it's very important that we figure out how to solve these collective problems in cities. But I think it's important that we don't allow our desire to solve those problems, which is driven by our compassion, to cause us to turn against capital accumulation. Capital accumulation is a major goal to making our lives better. But I'm definitely not against social programs that make cities more livable and that make our lives better.
Sure. I haven't heard any, not that I really pay attention to it much, but I haven't heard fire departments, police departments, general municipal services that we use for health and safety thought of as socialism, nor have I ever thought of them. It's an interesting. I'm going to look out for that because it's an interesting take. I think it's a wrong take as well. But
what larger governments do, so municipal are generally city and county governments. What state governments do is they coordinate city and county governments. They enforce rules against corruption. They provide services that are easier to administer at scale. Generally, when you have a big fire in California, it's not the city of San Francisco that fights it; it's the state of California,
along with often federal government help when it gets too big. Right?
And those kinds of nested hierarchies of government still accomplish the same goals of making sure we have sufficient infrastructure for capital to accumulate, but with different systems. And so, the American federal government serves the same role as the European Union does in Europe, but has a very different relationship with the states than the European Union does with its member states. But both cities in America and Europe generally have an easier time accumulating capital and building wealth and serving their citizens than cities in other places do. And so it's we argue about politics often from a top-down perspective, but politics is most functional from a bottom-up perspective. And so the president of the United States might be the most visible person in how government works, and the Congress might be the most visible people in how policy is formed. But the vast majority of government action and government behavior happens municipally as a percentage of everything. And those higher levels help that be efficient and effective.
It's like all politics is local, essentially, right?
All politics is local.
I hate to use sayings, but
all politics is social, except for kind of the religion of politics.
Right. I'm with you on that. So you use the term nested hierarchies. That's an uncommon term, but I've heard it before. Primarily by Jordan Peterson. Do you listen to him?
No, I've read about him as he's become controversial, but I've never heard one of his talks and I've never read one of his books.
Gotcha. Where have you heard that term before?
I don't know.
It's an unusual one.
I guess Dr. Peterson must have put it into the zeitgeist.
Or I'm sure it comes from somewhere else, but it's curious given
it's a common kind of phraseology in just engineering in general.
Oh, it's in engineering? Okay.
The idea that you have hierarchies of logic is necessary for doing programming.
You know what? I always saw it as an academic word, but you're right that so much of engineering is academic because you actually have to know what the hell you're doing and understand the theory behind it. So,
I would say a higher percentage of engineers have used the word nested hierarchy in the last 5 years than percentage of math professors.
Okay, I like it. All right. All right, so this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I didn't think it would go where we went with it, although I never know how can you know where a conversation is going to go? But this has been really illuminating, so I wanted to thank you. Before we go, there are 2 questions I wanted to ask you. The first is, out of all of your experiences, what is the key lesson that you think that you would advise someone that you cared greatly about? If you were giving someone advice, what would that be?
Eat every day, poop every day, sleep every day.
Okay. I didn't expect it, but hey, I didn't expect anything. And then let's get the last thing. I want one thing that you're grateful for, and you can always pass on that too, but there's not enough out there where people talk about things they're happy about, so I try to do that.
Grateful for my wife and my loving parents and my siblings and the social infrastructure that allows me to have a kind of broader field of view than just my daily struggles at work.
That's profound, man. Well, Ryan, thank you for coming to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, it's been fun.